They called it a strategic realignment. That's the phrase my son-in-law used when he walked into my office that Tuesday morning, set his laptop on my desk without asking, and told me my 22 years of building supplier relationships in the Gulf region were, quote, a liability in the current operating environment. I remember looking at him for a long moment. He was wearing a tie I'd never seen before, some kind of geometric pattern, the kind you buy when you want to look serious without having earned it. He had his MBA from Wharton framed on the wall of his new office down the hall. My daughter had married him 3 years ago, and I had genuinely liked him then. I still remembered shaking his hand at the rehearsal dinner, thinking, this kid has something. I wasn't wrong about that. He did have something. He just didn't know what he didn't know. We're moving to an integrated AI procurement platform, he said. The relationships you've built are valued, but they don't scale. I nodded. I thanked him for the conversation. I walked back to my own office, sat down in the chair I'd sat in for the better part of 2 decades, and stared out the window at the Houston skyline for about 10 minutes. Then, I started making a few phone calls. Not to fight, just to say goodbye the right way. That was 6 weeks before the Doha deal collapsed. Let me back up. I'd spent 22 years at Halcyon Energy Solutions, a mid-size oil and gas services company based in Houston. We weren't ExxonMobil. We weren't Halliburton, but we had something those giants sometimes lost. We were nimble and we were trusted. I'd built our Gulf operations from a single contract with a Qatari firm into a portfolio that represented nearly 40% of the company's annual revenue. Qatar, UAE, Bahrain. I knew which families controlled which decisions, which ministry officials preferred to meet for coffee before any document was ever placed on a table, and which agreements meant nothing until the right elder in the room gave a nod that wasn't in any meeting minutes but was more binding than any contract language. My name wasn't on the masthead. I was VP of International Supply Chain, but our CEO, a man named Douglas, old-school oil man who'd started roughnecking in Louisiana at 19. He used to say, if something goes sideways in Doha, there's one phone call I make. You know who answers it. Then Douglas retired. The new CEO came from a private equity background. Sharp guy, good instincts for domestic markets. He brought in his own team. His daughter was on that team. She'd married my son-in-law 2 years before Douglas left, and when the new leadership restructured, my son-in-law was elevated to Chief Operations Officer. Overnight, he went from Director of Process Innovation to the third most powerful person in the company. He was 34 years old. I want to be fair to him because I've had time to think about this without the bitterness clouding it. He wasn't stupid. He was genuinely brilliant at process design, at mapping efficiencies, at building dashboards that could show you 10 data points in 3 seconds that used to take an analyst a week to compile. In a domestic context, in a world of standardized vendor contracts and GAAP-compliant procurement cycles, he would have been exactly what you'd want in that role. The problem wasn't his intelligence. The problem was that he'd never once sat across a table from a Qatari procurement director who considered it mildly offensive to discuss contract figures before the second cup of tea. He didn't know what he didn't know, and nobody told him, because he was the COO and his father-in-law was the CEO, and that particular organizational chart had a way of discouraging candid feedback. The Doha contract was the biggest single deal in Halcyon's history. $40 million over 7 years, a preferred supplier agreement with Qatar Meridian Petroleum, a state-linked entity that controlled infrastructure maintenance across a significant portion of the country's upstream operations. We'd been building toward that contract for 4 years. I'd personally flown to Doha 9 times. I knew their lead negotiator, a quiet, meticulous man who'd studied engineering in Edinburgh and law at Georgetown, who collected first-edition American novels, and who had told me over dinner the previous December that Halcyon was, in his estimation, the right company for this work. That dinner happened in January. By March, I was out. Transitioning to an advisory role was the official language. It meant no direct reports, no seat at the negotiating table, and a 6-month window before they'd reassess my position within the organization. My son-in-law framed it as an opportunity. He said advisory roles could be incredibly valuable. He said it the way someone says something they've rehearsed in the mirror, but don't quite believe. I signed the paperwork. I didn't make a scene. I moved my things to a smaller office near the parking garage, and I watched. What I watched was this. My son-in-law assigned two of his process analysts, both under 32, both excellent at what they did, to lead the final stages of the Qatar Meridian negotiation. He built them a procurement platform powered by an AI system that could generate proposal language, model pricing scenarios, and draft contract terms in real time. It was genuinely impressive technology. I would have found it useful, actually, as a tool, as a replacement for experience. It was something else entirely. The first sign of trouble came in April, about 5 weeks after my reassignment. I heard through someone I trusted in our legal department that the Qatar Meridian team had gone quiet. They'd responded promptly and warmly to every communication for 4 years. Suddenly, emails were taking 4 to 6 days to get responses. A call that had been on the calendar for 2 weeks got rescheduled twice. In Qatari business culture, this is not rudeness. It's a signal. It means something has made them uncomfortable, and they're giving you space to correct it without making the discomfort explicit. You have to know how to read it. My son-in-law's team did not know how to read it. They interpreted the silence as a scheduling issue and responded by increasing the frequency of their outreach. Automated follow-up emails generated by the platform. Precise and professional and completely tone-deaf to what was actually happening. I found out later, much later, what had specifically caused the discomfort. One of the analysts had sent a proposal package that was, technically, very good. Comprehensive pricing model, detailed service-level commitments, a beautifully formatted PDF that looked like it had come from a company 3 times our size. The problem was that it had been sent without any preceding personal communication. No acknowledgement of the ongoing relationship. No reference to any of the conversations I'd had with their lead negotiator over the previous years. It arrived in their inbox like a piece of direct mail, efficient, impersonal, and implicitly communicating that the people on the other side of this deal were interchangeable. In Qatari business culture, relationships are the contract. The document you sign is a formality that follows an agreement that has already been made through trust and time. When you send a proposal package without honoring that, without even acknowledging it, you're not being efficient. You're being disrespectful, and you probably don't even know it. Their lead negotiator did not say any of this because that is not how this works. He just quietly stopped returning calls on the same day he used to return them. I knew what was happening. I said nothing because nobody had asked me, and because I'd learned long ago that unsolicited advice inside a family-run power structure is rarely received as advice. It's received as a challenge. Then came the second thing. In May, my son-in-law flew to Doha with his 2 analysts. He'd scheduled a meeting to finalize the contract framework, essentially a handshake session before the legal teams took over. He'd prepared for it the same way he prepared for everything, thoroughly, on paper, with data. He had a presentation. He had a leave behind. He had a timeline for the signing. What he didn't have was an understanding of the meeting format. The Qatar Meridian team actually expected. They'd anticipated something informal, a relationship conversation. They wanted to talk about the partnership, about long-term vision, about shared values. They were not expecting a 38-slide PowerPoint, certainly not one that opened with a cost-efficiency analysis. I heard this from someone in our legal department who'd attended as an observer and had the good sense to feel deeply uncomfortable throughout. He said the room changed in the first 7 minutes. He said the Qatar Meridian team remained polite. They are always polite. But something went out of their eyes. They listened. They asked a few procedural questions. They said they would need time to review. They thanked everyone for making the trip. My son-in-law came back to Houston believing the meeting had gone well. 3 weeks later, Qatar Meridian sent a letter. It wasn't a rejection letter exactly. It was more measured than that. It expressed continued interest in a partnership with Halcyon Energy Solutions. It noted, however, that given recent changes in Halcyon's organizational structure, they felt it would be prudent to pause the current process and allow both parties to re-establish the foundation of the relationship before proceeding to contract. They requested a meeting with senior leadership. Specifically, they named me. They didn't say my title. They used my name. I found out about the letter because our general counsel called me directly, bypassing my son-in-law entirely. She had been with the company for 16 years and had no patience for organizational politics when $840 million was in play. They asked for you by name, she said. I know what that means, I said. So do I. The question is whether the COO knows what it means. He did not. Or rather, he understood it intellectually but processed it as a logistical problem rather than a signal. He wanted to send a response letter explaining that I was in an advisory capacity and that the negotiating team would be happy to reconnect. He thought that would address it. Our general counsel walked into his office and closed the door. I don't know exactly what she said. I know it involved the phrase existential risk to our Gulf portfolio. I know it was not a gentle conversation. And I know that by the end of that day, my son-in-law had called me into his office and told me, with visible effort, that the company needed me to step back into a direct role on the Qatar account. He did not apologize. He came close. He said, I think we may have moved too fast on some of the transition elements. That was the closest he got. I told him I appreciated that. And I meant it. It costs something to say that. When you're 34 and you've just been told that your approach nearly killed the biggest deal in company history. I gave him credit for saying it, even imperfectly. Then I went back to my original office. Someone had to move a box of files from a storage room that had been staged there in the interim. And I picked up the phone. I called Doha. Not the general line. Not through an assistant. I called a cell phone number I'd had for 4 years, belonging to their lead negotiator. It rang 3 times. He picked up. I said, I understand there's been some confusion. I wanted to call personally to say I'm still here, and I'd very much like to come see you. There was a pause. Then he said, I was hoping you would call. That was a Tuesday. I was on a flight Wednesday evening. I met with him Thursday morning in his office, not in a conference room. We talked for 2 hours. Not about the contract, about his eldest son, who just enrolled at UT Austin, about the summer heat, which he found brutal and I had long since stopped noticing, about a book he'd been reading, Cormac McCarthy, which surprised me until it didn't, because the man had eclectic tastes and a long memory for good stories. Somewhere in the second hour, without any formal transition, we began talking about the partnership, what both companies needed, where the uncertainties were, what would make the 7-year commitment feel solid on their end. I did not bring a presentation. I had 1 page of handwritten notes in my jacket pocket that I never took out. By Friday afternoon, we had a framework. Not signed, not formal, but real. The kind of agreement that exists before lawyers touch it, built entirely on the understanding that both people in the room mean what they say. I flew home Saturday. By the following Thursday, the formal process had resumed. The legal teams were back in contact. The timeline was restored. 6 weeks later, the contract was signed. $840 million, 7 years, with a renewal option that our general counsel called the most favorable long-term clause I've seen in 20 years of energy contracts. I want to tell you what happened afterward, because this is the part the story usually skips. My son-in-law and I had a real conversation about 3 weeks after the contract was signed, not in the meeting room. He came by my office late on a Friday when most people had already left for the weekend. He sat down without being asked. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Walk me through what I missed." That was the moment I decided he might actually be okay. I told him about the tea. I told him about the rhythm of communication in Qatari business relationships, the way silences have meaning, the way proposals carry relational messages whether you intend them to or not. I told him about the first visit I'd made 12 years ago, when I'd committed a minor protocol error during a meeting and our potential partner at the time had simply paused, offered me more coffee, and let the moment pass without comment. and how afterward my interpreter had quietly explained what I'd done, and I'd spent the next year learning what I should have known before I walked into that room. You can't AI generate that, I told him. Not because AI isn't useful. It is. But because the tool is only as good as the judgment behind it. And the judgment comes from the mistakes. And the mistakes come from the years. And there aren't any shortcuts to the years. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "Why didn't you say something earlier, when you could see it going wrong?" I thought about that. Honestly thought about it. "Because you didn't ask," I said. "And because in the position you were in, I wasn't sure you could have heard it." He nodded. He didn't argue with that. Which told me more about him than anything he could have said. He's still COO. I'm still VP of International Supply Chain, back in my original role, which no longer has the word advisory anywhere near it. The AI procurement platform is still in use. And honestly, for the domestic contracts, it's excellent. We found a way to make the tools work with the relationships instead of them. That took some organizational honesty that was uncomfortable for everyone. My daughter called me about a month after everything settled. She doesn't work at the company. She's a physical therapist, which always struck me as the wiser career. But she'd heard pieces of the story from her husband. She said, "Daddy, he doesn't always know how to say he's sorry, but he knows he was wrong." I told her I knew that too. What I didn't tell her was what I'd been thinking about since the whole thing ended. Not about my son-in-law, not about the contract, but about the 22 years themselves. About every trip I'd almost not taken, every relationship I'd almost not bothered to build. Every time someone had told me I was spending too much time in Doha, that I needed to delegate more, that the relationship stuff was soft and the data was what mattered. There's a version of this story where I get bitter, where I come back, save the deal, and spend the next 5 years making sure everyone knows it was me. I've met people who would tell this story that way. I understand the impulse. I just don't think it serves anything. The deal got done. The company is stronger for it. And somewhere in Doha, a lead negotiator with a taste for McCarthy novels is 3 years into a 7-year partnership that I believe, genuinely, is good for both sides. That's the whole story. Except for one thing. A few months after all this, a young analyst on my team, sharp kid, 2 years out of Rice University, had more energy than anyone I'd met in a long time, came to my office to tell me he'd just been offered a position with a larger firm. He was torn about it. He wanted my opinion. We talked for a while about the opportunity, about what he wanted his career to look like, about the difference between a title and a trajectory. At some point, he asked me how I built the Gulf relationships, whether there was a framework, a process, some replicable system he could apply. I looked at him for a moment. Then I said, "The framework is showing up. The process is caring about the person before you care about the deal. And the system is doing that consistently for years. Until it isn't a system anymore, it's just who you are." He thought about that. He stayed at Halcyon. I'd like to think that was the right call, but honestly, that's for him to find out. What I know is this. You can build a lot of things with technology. You can model pricing, automate follow-up, generate proposal language that sounds like it came from someone who's been in the room. But the room itself, the actual room, with the tea getting cold and the window light shifting, and the other person deciding whether they trust you, that room doesn't have a platform yet. And in my experience, it never will.